Saint John Paul II and Saint Marcel the Moderate, Part 3 on the Meaning of Catholic Guild Family Stream. Jesus is King! Everybody, welcome to the Guild Family Stream. I'm Timothy Flanders. This is the Meaning of Catholic. I'm streaming today from Flanders Family Trapping Company Deer Camp. As you can see, there's the buck. I'm at my parents' house hunting, so we're a special studio appearance over here. Haven't taken any shots yet, but we'll see. Asking St. Anthony to find some meat for us, but we'll see. Today's stream is part 3 of a series we're doing, which is attempting to present a sympathetic, objective portrait and view of two men, Marcel Lefebvre and Saint John Paul II, the Pope, Karol Wojtyła. And there are reasons that in part 1, we talked about all the reasons for this, reason that we're doing these two men in particular. It's because these two men in particular have had a great deal of strong followers who love and venerate them. And as a result of that, there has been also a caricature to a degree, sometimes made unjustly from followers of one man to the followers of the other man, or the man himself. So in keeping with the mission of being a Catholic, these two men, we're examining them both sympathetically and objectively, not avoiding criticisms either, but making those criticisms from a place of understanding, so that we really understand what these men were about. What did they really teach? What did they really do? What were their motivations? What were their intentions? And today's show, we'll be talking about the fact that John Paul II is not a phenomenologist. This is a very common misconception among English speakers because of a particular Anglophone reality of John Paul II's work. We've already talked about problems with George Weigel's biography, so that's another Anglophone issue. There's Anglophone issues with John Paul II, so it makes sense that he's actually misunderstood based on these various Anglophone issues. So we'll talk about those today, and we'll also address some of the controversies with this series. This part of the series right now will be made public, so I just want to say a few things publicly. And if you want the full presentation, you do need to become a guild member. You can go to patreon.com/meaningofcatholic. Let me tell you what the presentation is going to be, though. And I don't even know if we'll have time for all of this today. We might need to do this particular section of our series in multiple parts. But let me see. First of all, let me see if I can make this larger. Okay, so we'll have first of all, we'll talk some about the controversy. That'll be the public portion, so we can address some of the controversies that have arisen with this particular series. And we'll talk about, can Lefebvre be called a saint? Can we venerate him? John Paul II's heroic sanctity, yet apparent scandal and mismanagement as Pope. We'll just briefly touch on that because we have a lot more detail and depth to go into all those things in the future. So we don't have time to go deep into those things, but we'll just touch on those real quick. And then we need to give a little historical introduction to Western philosophical problems, particularly post-Trent. And that's what forms the context for phenomenology. So then we'll have the introduction to phenomenology. What is phenomenology? We'll talk about Edmund Husserl, Franz Brentano, who teaches Aristotle to two Jews, a good Jew and a bad Jew. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Augustinian phenomenology versus idealistic phenomenology. We will mention St. Teresa Benedicta a Croce as well, and Dietrich von Hildebrand. And then we'll talk about what is the difference between Archbishop Lefebvre's France and Wojtyła's Poland, because this is a very significant historical aspect to this. because phenomenology in Germany and Poland seems to have been significantly different than phenomenology in France. And also the political history of Poland and the political history of France also goes into these things very deeply and gives us a very a deeper understanding and a context for understanding Lefebvre and Wojtyła. Then we'll talk. Once we get all through that introduction, I'm not even sure if we'll get to this part yet in this particular broadcast, but then we'll get much more deeper into John Paul II's work back when he was Karol Wojtyła, back when he was Father Karol Wojtyła, and then he was later Bishop Wojtyła at Vatican II. We'll talk about Wojtyła's Thomistic dissertation under Garrigou-Lagrange, which was in 1947. And we'll also talk about his anti-phenomenology dissertation on Max Scheler. His dissertation was against phenomenology. It actually made a conclusion that was negative. And so we'll quote showing that. And then we'll talk about the Anglophone issue that I mentioned, which comes from a Polish translator by the name of Tymienska. And she falsely translated the first English translation of Wojtyła's major philosophical work, Person and Act, into English as acting person. If you can tell already we have a translation issue if the Polish says person and act, but the English says acting person just for the title. She mistranslated the title itself. But we'll get into more of the content as why this sort of misrepresented Wojtyła's work and has contributed to this misunderstanding of Wojtyła that he is a phenomenologist, when in fact he is not a phenomenologist. We'll talk about what he really is in this whole presentation. So with all that, let's talk about some of the controversy. Can we talk about Archbishop Lefebvre as a saint? So first of all, let me make clear, there is obviously a distinction between what a decreed, formally recognized public saint, when there's a public cultus, what's called a public veneration, meaning the local bishop and or the Pope has formally promoted the veneration of a particular saint. But typically, historically, what happens is the veneration of a saint takes place before a public recognition thereof. And this was especially true before Trent. There was just public veneration happened. Somebody died, and then after death, he or she worked miracles. Their relics were incorrupt. Devotion just spread, and the saint's cultus, his cult, his veneration, the rituals surrounding his veneration arose just organically. And then later on, the church recognized this and promulgated the decree. So it is the normal way of things that a man becomes venerated as a saint before the church recognizes that. So that's first of all the case. Now, second of all, we need to also understand that it's perfectly normal for Catholics to believe that individual people are saints. For example, let's say your parents were particularly holy people and they died, and you believe that they're saints. And so you ask them to pray for you. You have no evidence that they're actually in purgatory or heaven. You just really believe that they are. Is a Catholic allowed to do that? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's nothing wrong with privately venerating an individual because you believe that he or she is a saint. For me personally, I am a disciple of Dietrich and Alice von Hildebrand. So I certainly know that they were very holy, virtuous Catholics, faithful Catholics, died in the bosom of the church. So I certainly believe that they are saints, but I have no evidence, and the church has not declared such. Now, there's a distinction between doing that and then forming a cult in the bad sense of the word. If we form a cult in the bad sense of the word around an individual and say he's a saint, but the church has not recognized that, that can be a bad thing. That can, and cults such as this have arisen for different people, and there's dangers of that happening. That's a real danger. But one can do so within limits. One can say privately, my opinion is that the excommunication of Archbishop Lefebvre was unjust or an error, or was a positive error on the part of the papal decree in some way. So, for example, and sometimes Catholics understand this intuitively. They understand that there's a political thing going on, and there's some injustice going on. An example of this very important example is Pope Martin IV, and he was a French pope that was appointed pope under the pressure from St. Louis IX's evil brother. So King St. Louis IX, a great saint, he had an evil brother. His name was Charles of Anjou. And Charles of Anjou pressured the papal conclave. They got this French pope. His name was Martin IV. And Charles of Anjou pressured Martin IV to excommunicate the Catholic Emperor of Constantinople, because at that time, the churches had been reunited at the Council of Lyon. And so we have this wicked king who pressures a political pope to make a false excommunication, which he does. And then he calls a false crusade, which he does. And thank God, God did not allow this false crusade to succeed in conquering Constantinople, which would have been the second unjust conquering. So this is an example of an unjust excommunication. Another example is Pope Boniface VIII excommunicating unborn children. Well, that's unjust. You can't excommunicate an unborn child. But the most famous example is obviously St. Joan of Arc. St. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake as a heretic by the local bishop. It was 14 something. I don't have the date in front of me, but it was during the 100 Years' War. It may have been late 1300s, but the 100 Years' War stretched from mid 1300s, mid 1400s. St. Joan of Arc was excommunicated by the local bishop. She died as a heretic. She was excommunicated. She was obstinate in her vocation. Okay. So obviously she was venerated by Frenchmen for centuries and centuries and centuries. And this was not even a private veneration that I'm talking about. It was definitely a public veneration. So the official church decree was that she was a heretic, basically. She died excommunicated. She died outside the church, formally, in all the formal senses of that term. But nevertheless, she was venerated, and eventually she was vindicated. So this is what some followers of Archbishop Lefebvre argue, that such is the case with Archbishop Lefebvre. You can go to Kennedy Hall's channel. He has a video where he argues that Archbishop Lefebvre's death excommunicated was not actually a death excommunicated. It was not actually a death outside the church. One can make a reasonable argument to that effect, and Kennedy does that. And he makes a reasonable and convincing argument. Now, one could also make a reasonable and convincing argument on the other side. That's reasonable, and it's within the bounds of a Catholic debate. One could have a Catholic debate and reasonably have a debate or disagreement about this, as long as everyone submits to the authority of the church and say, well, we can't create a cultus and promulgate a liturgy commemorating Saint Marcel Lefebvre if and only if unless there is an actual decree of his sainthood. The veneration of Saint Joan of Arc went on for centuries, sort of unofficially. So as long as we're not creating a real cult in the bad sense of the term, as long as we're still working within the bounds of Catholic orthodoxy, Catholic order, the order of the church, one can make a reasonable argument, and one can privately venerate Archbishop Lefebvre if one believes in one's conscience that he is a saint. Now, this goes into the Catholic teaching of conscience, which we don't have time to get into, but suffice it to say that there is a true, if you have a properly formed conscience, one can make a decision like this. Now, all I'm saying is this series is named St. John Paul II and St. Marcel Lefebvre, simply to show the fact that the followers of both of these men follow their sanctity in particular. They follow them as saints. Now, obviously, St. John Paul II is officially promulgated as a saint, but we've also talked about reasonable disagreements with that as well. So the bottom line is we're already spent 15 minutes on this. We're definitely not going to get through the whole presentation. The point I'm trying to simply say is that all Catholics deserve a sympathetic and charitable examination of their lives. I mean, I'm sure 100 years from now, if anybody cares about what Timothy Flanders said or did, there's a way to evaluate what I said, and I'm probably going to miss a lot of things and not anticipate what could have happened with this or that thing, and all sorts of blind spots that I have. But the attitude of the church, even in the case of an excommunicated individual, because the law above every law is the salvation of souls, even the church, I argue, desires mercy even for the excommunicated. And so did not the church rejoice at the canonization of St. Joan of Arc? Did not the church rejoice that the ecclesiastical authority was in fact proved wrong? Yes, because the salvation of souls is a greater glory than the infallibility of the local bishop or the infallibility of the excommunication. It is a greater glory for God that souls are saved than if a bishop had the proper information in his intellect to make the proper determination at this and that time. So that is the motivation for this series. It is to provide a sympathetic view of both men, which Christian charity demands that we do, and truth and charity demand that we do so as objectively as possible, submissive to the authority of the church, and within these bounds as Catholics. So that's all for the public portion of this video. So if you want the full presentation on why John Paul II was not a phenomenologist and all this, you have to go to patreon.com/meaningofcatholic. You can also donate at meaningofcatholic.com/donate, or you can contact, if you can't afford it, you can always get free membership as well. So contact me at meaningofcatholic.com/contact. Okay.